The French defense is a very solid defense against the king's pawn. Furthermore, it is rich in tactical and strategic ideas. It is a counterattacking defense, and black, after the move e4, wants to counterattack on the e4 point with the move d5, but first plays the move e6 to defend the pawn when it reaches d5 and thus be able to recapture with the pawn instead of having to capture with the queen. Now, it is normal for white to occupy the center with the move d4, and black reacts immediately with the move d5. The disadvantage of the French defense is that black often finds himself with little space, and the bishop on c8 is often a problematic piece because it is often trapped within the pawn chain. One of the most common strategic plans in the French defense is to try to exchange this bad bishop for white's good bishop, with moves like b6, then develop it to a6 and exchange it for the bishop, or even bishop d7, then move to b5, which will be supported by a queen on b6, which would also allow the bishop to be exchanged. Another very interesting maneuver to bring this passive bishop to life is the maneuver bishop d7, bishop e8, and once the f-pawn has advanced, it can be developed to the g6 or h5 square. From this position, white has three basic options. One would be to exchange pawns, which is the exchange variation, another option would be to advance, which would be the advance variation, and another option would be to defend the pawn with the move knight to c3 or with the move knight to d2. Let's look at them one by one. From this position, if white exchanges pawns with the move e, capturing on d5, the exchange variation would be entered. Black replies with e capturing on d5, and has already solved the problem of his problematic bishop, so the exchange variation isn't very dangerous for black. For example, if white plays c4, immediately attacking the black pawn, black can respond with knight f6, and after knight c3. Bishop b4 and a position will be reached in which white will likely have an isolated pawn on d4. Black has no problem. Another possibility after e captures on d5 would be bishop d3, which removes the f5 square so that black's bishop cannot develop easily, but black can continue with bishop d6. After knight c3, black could now continue knight c6 with a very symmetrical and equal game, or try to break the symmetry with the move knight e7, with the idea of then bringing the bishop to f5 and exchanging it for white's. Short castling could follow, and black will bring the bishop to f5 to exchange it for white's. They can reinforce the center with the move c6, the queen's knight can develop on the d7 square, and the rooks will occupy the open file. Black has no problem. The second possibility white has from this position is to advance in the center with e5. White conquers space, takes the f6 square from black's knight, and wants to mount an attack on the kingside. The disadvantage is that the tension in the center is diluted, leaving black free to counterattack. Black must react vigorously to avoid being restricted by too little space, so c5 is an almost obligatory move. Black's plan is clear: break white's pawns. So black answers c3 so that in case black exchanges on d4, he can continue to keep both pawns in the center. Now it wouldn't be good for black to capture on d4 because after c captures on d4, the c3 square is free, and white's knight could develop on that square. So it's better to wait to exchange until a more opportune moment. With the move knight c6, the pressure on the d4 point continues to increase. If white now defends the center with the move f4, then black could continue to increase the pressure with moves like knight h6, and knight to f5, queen b6, and would have a very good game. And if after knight c6 white defends the center with knight f3, queen b6 can follow, increasing the pressure on the d4 square and keeping an eye on the b2 square. Now white could easily develop with the bishop e2, followed by c capture on d4, c capture on d4, and now they can play the knight to h6 with the idea of going to f5 and increasing the pressure on the d4 square. The bishop cannot capture because after bishop takes on h6, the queen takes on b2 would follow. White has to defend the rook, for example, with knight d2, followed by g takes on h6, and black is doing very well. They have the g file open, they can continue with bishop b4. If the rook attacks the queen can capture the a2 pawn and then advance with the a pawn, which would be a passed pawn. Black has very good play. So, after the knight moves to h6, white can develop quietly with knight c3, which can be followed by knight f5 by putting pressure on d4. White can play knight a4 attacking the queen, queen a5 check, bishop d2, bishop b4, and white defends with bishop c3. But black can continue with the move b5, which attacks the knight and would force the move a3, counterattacking on the bishop. Bishop captures on c3 check, knight captures c3, and now black plays b4 and gains an advantage on the queen side. For example, a captures b4, queen captures b4, black is threatening on d4 and b2, and also has the b-file open and a fairly comfortable position. For example, in case of bishop b5, black could follow bishop d7, and after bishop captures c6, bishop captures c6, queen d2, black can castle, try to occupy the b-file, and advance with the a-pawn. Another possibility for white is to enter the Milnerberry gambit with the move bishop d3. After c captures d4, c captures d4, now black couldn't capture the pawn with knight capturing d4, because the knight would then capture d4, and after the queen captures d4, then bishop b5 would be check, and black would lose the queen. So, after c captures d4, black plays bishop d7 to cover that check, and now they are threatening to capture on d4. But white's idea is to sacrifice that pawn. Short castling, which could be followed by a knight capturing d4, knight capturing d4, queen capturing d4, and white has an active piece game in exchange for the pawn. For example, after the knight moves c3, black now doesn't capture the pawn on d5 because then the open central files would be very dangerous. For example, after queen for d5 could follow rook to e1, and the rook on the king's file could allow tactics with knight capturing d5. So, after the knight moved to c3, the best move for black is not to capture the second pawn and play the move a6, and black is doing very well. White will have a hard time proving compensation for the down pawn. Normally, after the queen moved to b6, white will contest a3 with the intention of advancing with b4 and thus being able to defend the b2 point. However, once white has made the move a3, black can advance with c4, gaining space and taking control of the weak white squares. After knight b to d2, knight a5 can follow, and black's plan is to block the queenside with moves like knight b3, bishop d7, bishop a4, and castle long. Therefore, the king will be very secure in that area, and then they can counterattack on the king side with moves like h6, g5. The knight can go to e7 and then go to g6 or f5. The bishop will develop via e7, which will support the break with f6 to attack the center. The rooks on the g and h files can support the advance of the pawns from behind to attack in this area. Black will have very good piece play. For their part, white will want to make the break f4 and f5, which is the only possible pawn break they have in this position. They can support it with moves like knight h4, g3 for bishop h3, and the knight can recycle via f1 to go to the e3 square and also support that break. White's third option in this position is to defend the pawn with the knight, knight c3, and now black can play knight f6, entering the classical variation. Now white has two options, advance the pawn or pin with the bishop. If white plays the move bishop g5, threatening e5, black responds with bishop e7 to unpin his knight, e5, knight f to d7. Now white exchanges the dark squared bishops, capturing on e7. The attack with h4, the famous Alekhine-Chittard attack, is not at all dangerous because black does not respond with bishop taking on g5 which would win a pawn but open lines on the king side, nor with h6 which would greatly weaken the king side. It is better to continue his attack on the queen side with the move a6 and continue as in the main variation. If white plays queen g4, black can easily continue with h5 attacking the queen, and after queen g3, g6, the king side is practically closed and black can easily start his counterattack on the queen side with moves like c5, b5, knight c6, etc. Black is doing very well. So, after the move knight to d7, white's best move is bishop takes on e7, which takes away black's good bishop, and after queen takes e7, white wants to form a strong pawn center with f4. Now, the move c5 would be a mistake because white would respond with knight b5 and then enter the d6 square. So, after f4, black's best move is a6, which takes away that possibility for the knight. The game can continue with knight f3, c5 to break the central pawns, and now, since white has the knight on c3, they can't advance the pawn to reinforce their center. So, white plays d captures c5, knight captures c5, bishop d3, knight c6, queen d2, bishop d7. In the French defense, it's usually good to delay castling as long as possible because if black castled too early, it would give white a clear attack target on this flank. Now white can castle short, and now black can castle kingside. Black's plan is clear, attack on the queenside with moves like b5 and b4 to expel the knight. They can also exchange the bishop with a knight and capture on d3, or make the knight move to a4, which would attack the knight on c3 and the pawn on b2. The rook would then move to the open c-file. They can also attack in the center with moves like f6, or if they prefer, with h6, waiting to see how white attacks. White, for his part, will want to break with f5 at some point or play more positionally with the move knight e2 and knight to d4. His idea will be to exchange the two black knights and end up with a good knight against black's bad bishop. The other possibility for white after the knight move to f6 is to advance with e5, gaining space in the center, immediately attacking the knight. Black plays knight f to d7, f4, c5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop e3, and now the variation with queen b6, increasing the pressure on d4 and also touching the point b2 only leads to a draw because white makes the move a3. Now, it would be a serious mistake to capture on b2 because knight a4 leaves the queen trapped. So, after a3, black plays c captures d4, which is followed by knight takes on d4, bishop c5, and after knight a4, which attacks the queen, queen a5 check would be forced. White retreats with knight c3 and is threatening to advance with b4. Therefore, the queen should return with queen b6, and it would be a draw by repetition of moves. So, after the move bishop e3, it is better to capture c takes d4, which would be followed by knight takes d4 and now bishop c5. The game can continue with bishop b5, and now black can castle kingside. If white now captures on c6 with the bishop, b takes c6 would follow, and after knight captures c6, black could respond with queen b6, leaving black in a very good position. And if after castling, white captures with the knight on c6, then b takes c6. Now, the bishop on e3 is undefended, so white has to play bishop captures c5, black would follow with knight captures c5. Now, bishop captures c6 would be bad because after rook to b8, black would have an advantage. They are threatening the pawn on b2. Also, with the rook on b4, they would trap the bishop. The queen move on b6 is also very strong. The bishop can develop via a6 to prevent white from castling. Once the rook is on b4, the knight can jump to the e4 square, and black is winning. So, after the knight captures on c5, the best move for white is queen d4, centralizing the queen and attacking the opponent's knight. Black can follow with queen b6. If the bishop now retreats, for example, bishop e2, then the queen can capture on b2, which attacks the rook. After the rook moves to b1 and queen a3, the queen defends the knight, and black would have an advantage. Therefore, after the queen moves to b6, white's best option is b4, and now black can respond with c takes b5, capturing the bishop. Now, it would be a bad move to capture with queen takes c5 because the queen would then capture with queen takes c5, and after b takes c5, then bishop d7, black has an advantage because they're going to capture the c5 pawn and put pressure on the open c-file. Therefore, after c takes b5, white has to play b takes c5, keeping the queens on the board. And after queen a5, black plans to develop the bishop via the d7 square or the a6 square and then bring in the rooks to capture the c5 pawn and put pressure along the c-file. Black would be fine. Or they could also make the interesting move, the knight d3, check, which attacks the queen. So, now, the queen would be forced to capture on d3, and now c takes b5, with the same idea as before of putting pressure along the open c-file. Now, white can't capture the pawn because after queen takes b5, the queen d4 would follow, attacking the knight and the f4 pawn, and black has an advantage. Another option white has to defend the pawn is the Tarrasch variation. Instead of developing the knight via c3, they can develop it via the d2 square to prevent it from being pinned by the bishop on b4. At the same time, they free the c3 square so the pawn can advance and thus strengthen the position of the d4 pawn. Now black has two options: attack the center directly with the move c5 or play the knight to f6. After c5, then e takes d5, and now black plays queen captures d5. Capturing with the pawn would be worse because it can lead to positions with the isolated queen pawn that are slightly advantageous for white. Therefore, it is better to capture with the queen. White can play the knight g to f3. White wants to attack the queen with the move bishop to c4, but first defends the pawn on g2 and the one on d4. Black captures in the center with c captures d4. Bishop c4, which attacks the queen. The queen retreats to queen d6, and white can castle. Black develops with knight f6, and after knight b3, white will regain the pawn. For example, after knight c6, knight b captures d4. Knight captures d4. Knight captures d4. And now it's important to play the move a6 to control the b5 square. Then the queen will retreat to the c7 square, from where it will attack the bishop, leaving the diagonal free for black's king's bishop to develop. White can play bishop b3 to defend their bishop, which can be followed by queen c7. Queen f3. Bishop d6, which is attacking the h2 pawn. White defends it with the move h3. Short castling. Bishop g5, attacking the knight on f6, and black responds knight to d7 with a very good play. After moving the rook to b8, they can advance the pawn to b5 and develop the bishop on b7, which would attack the queen. The knight can go to c5 to exchange white's bishop, or it can go to the b6 square and then jump to the c4 square and block the bishop's action while attacking the b2 point. The bishop could also make the move bishop d7 and go to c6. Then the rooks will come to the open c-file and have a very good game. At this point, white cannot sacrifice on e6 with either the bishop or the knight because after the bishop captures e6, the knight goes to e5, which attacks the queen, and then they capture the bishop. And if they capture with the knight, after knight captures e6, then f captures e6. Now they are attacking the queen with the rook, and after bishop captures e6 check. King h8. The white queen has to retreat and has no good squares. The best option is queen d1, but after bishop c5, black has a piece for two pawns and is also threatening to go to the g3 square, which would attack the bishop and begin to put pressure on the f2 point. Black has an advantage. The other option black has after the move knight d2 is knight to f6. Now, white can decide to play with the isolated queen's pawn by moving bishop d3, followed by c5, which attacks the d4 point. White plays c3 to reinforce the defense of his central pawn. After c captures d4. C captures d4. Black continues d captures e4 and has isolated white's queen's pawn. Knight captures e4. Now it would be a serious mistake to capture the pawn with queen captures d4 because bishop e5 would then give check, and black's queen is lost. But after the knight captures e4, black can play bishop d7 to place the bishop on the long diagonal and control the d5 square, which is the one in front of the isolated pawn, to block it. Therefore, after the move knight to f6, it is better for white to advance with e5. Black plays knight f to d7. c3 follows. c5, and now white has two options. He can play f4, to reinforce the pawn center, after knight c6. Knight d to f3, reserving the e2 square for the other knight and thus further reinforcing the d4 point. But now black follows c captures d4. c captures d4. Queen b6, increasing the pressure on the d4 point and on the b2 point. White can play g3, with the idea of developing the bishop toward the h3 square and trying to break with f5. Black can play bishop b4 check. Now white can't cover himself because the d4 point would be undefended, so the only move for white is king f2. But now black has a very good move with g5, which completely breaks white's center. If white now captures with the knight, knight captures g5. Then the queen captures on d4, giving check, and they would be in very good shape. And if they capture with the pawn, with f capturing g5, then the knight can capture on e5, taking advantage of the pin. The pawn cannot capture. Black has a very good game. Another possibility for white after the move c5 is to develop the bishop to d3, developing the bishop. Then knight c6 could follow, increasing the pressure on the d4 point. Then knight e2 could follow. White develops the knight to the e2 square to reserve the f3 square for the other knight and thus doubly reinforce the d4 point. c captures d4. c captures d4. And now, with the move f6, black definitively attacks white's pawn center and is going to destroy it. After e captures f6. Knight captures f6, white continues with knight f3, which can be followed by bishop d6. Short castling. And now white's plan is to try to exchange the dark squared bishops and try to occupy the e5 point. Therefore, black makes the move queen c7, which controls the f4 point so that the white bishop cannot go to that square. Bishop g5 can follow. White wants to execute the maneuver bishop h4 and bishop g3, to finally exchange the dark squared bishop. Black can castle. Bishop h4. But now black makes the move knight h5, which controls the g3 square so that the bishop cannot go to exchange for black's bishop. And black's plan is very clear, they will try to advance the pawns on the kingside. The queen can then go to the g7 square to put pressure on the d4 point. With the move a6, black will prevent the white bishop from reaching the b5 square to eliminate the knight on c6, and will also discourage the knight on c3 from going to b5. The bishop on c8 can recycle through the d7 and e8 squares and then move to the g6 or h5 squares. The knight could jump to the f4 square, attacking the bishop, and then black will try to double rooks on the f-file. Black has a very good game. White, for his part, can advance on the queen side with moves like a3 and b4, to try to expel the knight on c6 and occupy the e5 square. They will place their rook on the half-open e-file to put pressure on the weakness of e6. The other rook will be very well positioned on the c-file. The bishop can retreat to square b1 and then, with the queen move d3, set up a battery with the queen and bishop to invade through square h7 and attack the black king. I hope you've learned the fundamental ideas of the French defense and can now apply them in your own games. If you enjoyed the video, please like it, subscribe, and share it on your social media.